the book is a book about political philosophy, including what some famous philosophers have had to say about justice and rights and the common good. And so we deal with Aristotle and Immanuel Kant and John Stuart Mill and John Rawls and some others. But the aim of the book is to inform public discourse. And so it approaches these philosophers not as artifacts in the history of ideas, but as participants in arguments in which we are still engaged. So a lot of the book, as Bernie said, is about the contemporary moral dilemmas and political controversies that animate us and roil the public debate. The healthcare debate, for example. The outrage over bailouts and bonuses. The debate over affirmative action. The gap between rich and poor. Debates about the role of the state vis-a-vis the market. Military conscription. Surrogate motherhood. A range of contemporary issues that raise big philosophical questions. The idea in the book, as in the course, is to persuade readers, students, participants in this enterprise that the convictions and the opinions we have, and we do care about these issues, and we have convictions about them, and sometimes we argue them fiercely in politics. These opinions and convictions rest on some of the big ideas about justice and the common good that the philosophers have explored. So it's really an invitation to moral and political philosophy, and an invitation to, or so I hope, to a richer kind of public discourse than the one to which we've been accustomed. What I'd like to do this evening is to give you an example. To start with one philosopher whose idea of justice I take up in the book, and to show how this philosopher's ideas do actually rumble just beneath the surface of contemporary debate. To make the challenge, to take the challenge at its most difficult, let's take Aristotle. Aristotle wrote back in the days of ancient Greece, the days of the Athenian polis. And in many ways, his idea of justice is remote, strange, and unfamiliar. These days we argue about justice mainly from the standpoint of promoting the general welfare, what will create more economic growth, for example, or respecting individual rights and freedom. Aristotle had a different idea of justice. So let me start with a very short lecture on Aristotle's theory of justice, and then we'll see how it applies. Is that all right? Here's the lecture. According to Aristotle, justice means giving people what they deserve. That's the lecture. That's what he thought. Now, you may say, well, that's relatively uncontroversial. The real controversies begin when it comes to figuring out who deserves what and why. Take the example of flutes. It's one that he himself gives. Suppose we have some flutes. We're trying to decide who should get the best ones. Well, what would you say? What would be the first answer that would come to mind? What would be the just way of distributing flutes? The best flute player. That's what Aristotle also said. But now here's a slightly harder question. Why? Why should the best flutes go to the best flute players, do you think? What do you say? They can make the best use of it. What else? Anyone?
That makes the enjoyment of the flute greater for all.
That makes, right. If the best flute players are playing the best flutes, that will make for the greatest enjoyment for everyone. That's a good reason to give the best flutes to the best flute players. But it's not Aristotle's reason. Now, it's a good example of a reason that's very familiar in contemporary moral and political argument, the utilitarian idea. The utilitarian says justice means doing whatever will promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, the most enjoyment for the audience. No one likes to hear bad flute playing. I remember this from when I went to hear, when my kids were in grade school, very young, and you go to the concerts and they play these plastic flutes, and it sounds awful, except when your child is playing. Then it sounds marvelous. So the enjoyment of everyone else is a good reason, but not Aristotle's reason for giving the best flutes to the best flute players. He had a different reason, and here's where his view seems maybe less familiar and accessible. Anybody have an idea? Some other idea? Some other reason for giving the best flutes to the best flute players? Any?
He's the one who will most appreciate the good flute. The best flute player is the one who will possibly most appreciate the best flute.
He'll most appreciate, he or she, the best flute player, will most appreciate and make best use of the best flute. That's Aristotle's reason, which actually depends on a strange idea. The best flute should go to the best flute players because that's what flutes are for, to be played well by a virtuoso. Now, this takes us really to the heart of what's puzzling and challenging about Aristotle's idea of justice. To reason about the right way, the just way of distributing things, requires that we first figure out what that good is for. What is its purpose? What is its point? What is its essential nature? And closely connected to that idea is the further idea that in figuring out the purpose or the point of a good, in this case the flute, is to figure out what virtues are worthy of honor and recognition. And in this case, one reason that the best flute player deserves the best flute is that musical performance is partly for the enjoyment of the listeners, but it's also for appreciation and for honoring and recognizing musical excellence. So, reasoning about the purpose of the good is closely connected to figuring out what virtues are worthy of honor and recognition. All right, that's flutes. Mainly quite remote from the things we most worry about these days. Let's take a contemporary case. It's a case about golf carts. There was a disabled golfer, maybe you've heard of him, Casey Martin, you remember a few years ago? Casey Martin was a very good golfer. He was on the golf team at Stanford along with Tiger Woods. They won the championship, but he was disabled. He had a very bad leg, a congenital circulatory problem, so that walking the course for 18 holes was very painful and even dangerous for him. And so he asked the PGA, the Professional Golfers Association, to be able to use a golf cart in the tournaments rather than have to walk. They refused. They said, no, everybody has to walk. That's part of the game. He sued under the Americans with Disabilities Act, which provided, this is a law of Congress that provided that public institutions had to make reasonable accommodations for those people who have disabilities, provided the accommodation didn't fundamentally alter the essential nature of the activity. So he sued. And it went, believe it or not, all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. This case about the right to a golf cart. Now, before I tell you how the Supreme Court ruled, imagine that you are on the Supreme Court. What would you say? How many would uphold his right to a golf cart? How many would say no, the PGA does not have to give him the use of a golf cart? Let's just see what the opinion is in the room. How many say he's got a right to the golf cart?
Or want him to, at least.
You want him to.
Right.
But you're the justice. You decide. You're deciding here. All right, and how many say no? They don't have to give him a golf cart. It's interesting. Almost an even division of opinion. So let's hear from those of you who would say that he does not have a right to a golf cart. What would be your reason? Who will get us started? Who will quickly give us a reason? Yes?
There might be another forum for those with similar constraints.
He can play, maybe he can, you would have him go play in the golf Special Olympics, something like that? Yes? So he can play elsewhere in a golf tournament for those with disabilities. Is that the reason most of you would turn him down? Yes.